Welcome to Tech Tuesday. My name is Ilya Basin. I'm lead for one of the leads for the Web Team Center for Sustainability, and I have developed this really cool open source framework that's called Supermodel. And the reason Supermodel is super cool is because it allows you to develop software projects in a fraction of the time that it would otherwise take you, without really cutting any corners on quality. And I mean, this is a pretty bold statement, so we'll spend the next hour talking about how this is achieved. And basically, Supermodel makes domain-driven design very easy on Microsoft development stack, and particularly but not necessarily using MVC, which stands for Model View Controller, which is Microsoft's web technology, and Entity Framework Code First, which is Microsoft's technology for accessing databases. So what is domain-driven design? Domain-driven design is a development approach or a design pattern that has gotten a lot of momentum lately in the development community. And you can check it out on your own if you go to domaindrivendesign.org. But really, the main idea is that domain entities are developed first. And when I say domain entities, I mean classes/objects that represent the domain in which your application operates. So the main idea, again, for the domain-driven design is that domain entities are developed first, and as they're developed, there is no concern whatsoever about how these entities are going to be presented to the user, which is there's no concern for the UI, for the user interface, and there is no concern about the persistence, which is how these entities are going to be stored, whether it's in a database or in a cloud or in a flat file, XML, whatever. Now, why is it important? Why is it important that entities are not concerned about persistence on the presentation? It's important for two reasons. Reason number one is when entities are designed without any external pressures and external dependencies and constraints, it gives the developer the power, and it really encourages the developer to take full advantage of object-oriented design features of languages like C# and develop an object model that truly describes the domain in which the application operates without having any constraints. The second reason why this is important is because the majority of the applications out there have the bulk of their complexity, the lion's share of their complexity, in their business logic, in entities. And if we can build that layer without any external dependencies to the persistence or the presentation, then we can take that layer and really easily switch different user interfaces and different database or not necessarily database, different persistent options. So what I mean by that is that we can take the business logic, which is the bulk of the complexity of the application, and swap the web interface, for example, to a web service interface, to a Windows application, to a Silverlight, whatever. And then on the back end, we can do the same with the persistence logic. We can take the database out and put a web service in, or we could do a flat file or a cloud storage or something like that. So let's take a look at how to properly design an application that is a DDD application in the Microsoft world if we're using MVC for the front end and Microsoft Entities Framework 4.1 Code First on the back end. So we start with entities. That's kind of the whole point of domain-driven design. We always start with entities. And so we develop entities. We need a place to store the entities. So let's put them in a database. Now, entities have no knowledge or no awareness of the fact that they're stored and where they're stored. So we need to have another layer that's called repositories that can basically take an entity and store it in a database, or take a database representation of that entity and unroll it in memory. In addition to that, what we need is a way to manage our transactions. So we need to be able to take multiple operations that happen across multiple entities and across multiple repositories and make them atomic. In other words, it all works or all fails. So there's a concept in Supermodel that we're going to talk about that's called unit of work that takes care of that. Then for the front end, remember we were talking about model view controllers. So we have views and we have controllers. Views are objects that are responsible for rendering HTML, what you're seeing on your screen. And controllers are things that pass the model to the view so the model can display that view, and also can take the user interactions and process them and apply those user interactions to the model. So we have views, we have controllers. What do we use for models? Should we use entities? We could, and very often people do, and I'm the one who's done it before too. But it's really not the right way to do it. And the reason it's not the right way to do it is because as soon as we take our entities and put them and entangle them with our presentation, we're going to start feeling a lot of pressure to change our entities to satisfy whatever we need to do in the presentation. Or even worse, we can potentially make our entities dependent on some things in our presentation. As a result, the entities are no longer independent. We cannot really swap the UI very easily. So instead of using entities in our front end, what we're going to do is we're going to introduce another layer that's called form models. So those are going to be the models that the controllers and the views pass back and forth. Now we have two levels of models. We need to be able to map between them, so we have entity mappers. Entity mappers are things that know how to take a form model and create an entity out of it, or how to take an entity and create a form model out of it. In addition to that, we will have model binders. So when the data comes back from the HTML page, we need to bind it to the model, and so we may need to have objects that know how to do that. We also may need view templates. Those are the things, this is standard MVC, and those are the things that will take a model and render an HTML representation for it. And the reason for that, we could have put this code in a view. But if we have a model that's displayed on multiple screens, we would be duplicating the code in multiple views. So instead, we will just have a view template, and then as soon as we encounter that model, it'll know how to render it. And last but not least is we need to take care of validation. And there is two places where validation takes place. There's a validation that happens when the user submits data to the website, and we need to make sure that whatever the user has submitted makes sense. You know, the from date is before the end date, or something that is supposed to be a number does not have characters in it. There's another place where validation happens is when we take our entities and persist them in a database. We want to make sure that our database storage has integrity, so we want to run another validation. Most of the time, these validations are the same. Sometimes there are some differences there. So it is important to make sure that we don't duplicate the code, but we still have an ability. We don't have duplicate code between the two types of validations, but we still have an ability, even though we define it once, to differentiate between two types of validations and define something special there. So this is really, really good architecture. If you think about it, this can take care of pretty much any eventuality that you have in a domain-driven design. But this is a really complicated architecture also. Look at all these layers that somebody has to sit down and write. And what comes to mind is Butler Lamson, one of the early computer scientists, had a lot of great quotes. And one of the quotes I think is very appropriate here. He said, "Any computer science problem can be solved by adding another level of isolation." And I think this is really case in point in what I was just describing. It's a really great architecture, but it has a ton of layers, and it's a lot of work to implement it. So what if you want to create something really simple? Do you really need all of that stuff? And we're not talking about the laziness, although all developers are lazy. And I think it's a sign of a good developer if you're lazy because you're trying to find a way to do things in a simpler and easier way. But it's not even just a question of being lazy. So let's say we do go and create this complicated architecture, and we do implement all of the proper layers, and we do everything absolutely right. It really makes our code not dry. Dry stands for do not repeat yourself. And it's really important because you know, if you think about going back to this architecture, if we need to change our entity and we need to add, let's say, a new property to it, we have to go through all of the layers, and not only entity we need to change, but we also need to change the form model. We also need to change the mapping between the form model and the entity. We need to change the view. We may need to change the controller. We may need to change the model binder. We definitely need to change the database schema and potentially repository. So you make one small change, and it requires you to hunt down almost a dozen places in your code where you need to change it. And if you forgot to do it, it won't compile, or even worse, you're going to get a runtime error. So it's not just a question of, you know, we implement all of these great layers, and it's a lot of work up front. It's not just up front, it makes our application not dry, which makes it more difficult to maintain if we want to introduce changes later. Also, about 80% of most of the applications are CRUD. And CRUD stands for create, update, delete. And it basically is the functionality where you take the data from the database, for example, display it on the screen, allow the user to edit it, and save it. So it's, you know, and also create a new record or delete a record. It's relatively simple functionality, but it's the bulk of the majority of the applications. And maybe the other 20% are really more complex functionality, but the majority is CRUD. And for CRUD, this kind of architecture is really overkill. It's overkill. It's too many layers. It's too much stuff to implement. It's a lot of extra work. On the other hand, if we don't have all the layers, we're going to end up with an application that is hard to extend. There's a reason for all of those layers. And we basically, without having them all in place, it makes our application more fragile going forward. If we want to do something with it that we didn't intend, it would be very difficult to do. It would require a lot of rework. So to recap, we have these two sort of extremes, two extreme approaches. One approach is on the left-hand side. If we do all of the proper domain-driven design layers, you know, what do we have? We have a lot of extra work. It's not dry. And it's complete overkill for a big portion of the majority of the applications. On the other side, to the right, we have this quick and dirty approach, sort of this cowboy programming, where, you know, a developer decides this is what we're going to do, and we get this monolithic applications with all the layers, and it's really inflexible, it's hard to extend, and it's really inconsistent. So every application is different, and it's difficult to maintain if the original developer is not the developer who's doing the maintenance. So realistically, none of these things happen. Neither right or left is happening. Realistically, what happens is a developer makes an educated guess and creates a compromise. And a developer thinks about, based on the imperfect information that exists in the beginning, how this application is going to grow, where it's going to go. And based on that, they make a decision on where they can cut corners to make left a little bit closer to the right. But this compromise is really not a good compromise, because depending on how close it is to the left or to the right, you're going to have, to some degree, the disadvantages that we have on the left and on the right. And we're going to have the combination of these. So what if you could keep simple things simple and complex things possible? And that's really what Supermodel attempts to do. So how does Supermodel do it? Well, remember, we want to keep things dry. Dry stands for do not repeat yourself. But we also want to keep all of the layers and not do all the extra work. So what Supermodel does is it takes advantage of the approach that's called convention over configuration. It also takes advantage of object-oriented design. Convention over configuration is something that first Ruby on Rails and then Microsoft MVC team really taught us all. And by us, I mean even Microsoft and other projects. And basically, the idea of this approach is that instead of configuring everything in your application, by default, by convention, if you don't specify certain things, the framework will make an educated guess of what you want and will provide you with the default implementation. And if implemented right, this convention over configuration approach will work in such a way that maybe for 95% of the cases, the default implementation is what you need. And then if you do need the configuration, you can still take care of the remaining 5% by providing your own configuration. So Supermodel, what Supermodel does is it provides the default implementation for all of the layers that are there. And most of the time, that's all you need. But it also gives you the flexibility to override those layers. And overriding is really easy because all of the layers are derived. It takes advantage of the object-oriented design, and all of the layers are derived and inherited. Derived and inherited is really the same thing. From the generic base classes. So if you want to create your own layer, you don't really need to do it from scratch. You derive from the base class, and you only need to specify what is different in your implementation of the layer compared to the default functionality. So if you want something that's very similar to what comes in default, you're not going to have to write a lot of code. If you want something that's completely different, yes, you do, but there's no way around it. So this way you get the benefits of the layered approach without all of the extra work. So if we go back to the architecture that we were talking about, the two rectangles in the middle are the only two things that you absolutely have to supply. Entities defines your domain, and form model really defines your user interface, what goes on the screen. Everything else has a default implementation and is provided to you by the framework, with the ability to replace it should you need to do something that is non-standard. So we talked a little bit about Supermodel. Let me talk about what is Supermodel. Supermodel is an open source framework. It's available on NuGet. For those who don't know, NuGet is sort of Microsoft's app store for development tools for Visual Studio. And I've submitted it to NuGet, and you can get it from there. It's intentionally misspelled. It's a holistic approach in a way that it's not a framework that solves one particular finite problem. It's a framework that gives you a way to write your entire application. And it makes it really natural to use good domain-driven design and good object-oriented design practices. And makes your code very, very dry. You only need to define what is different between the layers, which makes it really easy to maintain because you don't need to hunt down many different places in the code when something simple changes. And if you're using MVC on the front end, it gives you generic view templates and controllers that provide free CRUD. So basically, if you're writing an application that needs to do CRUD, you get the CRUD functionality practically for free. And you get more time and more energy and more money to spend to work on the remaining part of the application that is probably more interesting and more complex. And last but not least, that I really want to, I can't emphasize this enough, is that there's plenty other tools out there that provide you free CRUD. But very often with these tools, if you don't like what they give you, and if you want to tweak it a little bit, you pretty much have to start from scratch, erase whatever they give you, and start from scratch and write your own. Not so with Supermodel. If you want something different but very similar to what already exists out there, you just need to define what is different. And that's really the main, I think, advantage and the main idea of this framework. And once we go into the demo, hopefully you'll be able to see that. So I've been always of the opinion that the best presentations for the software tools are the ones where you spend most of the time in Visual Studio, not in PowerPoint. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a little demo of we're going to create a simple website using Supermodel. This is a very short demo, so I can't really cover everything that I'd like to cover. I have a 3-hour demo that sort of a boot camp that I did for our team here. When we started using Supermodel. This one is going to give you more of a flavor of what it's like. And I would be very happy if somebody is interested to set up the time to go through the complete sort of learning session. So what I have here is I have a Visual Studio open. And I have a project here. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to NuGet, and I'm going to add Supermodel to my project. And as I mentioned before, NuGet is Microsoft's app store for developer tools. And here it is. I'm going to go ahead and install it. And let me walk you through what I have as a starting point with this solution. To save the time, I already pre-created the solution, but I didn't really do very much with it. It's a standard MVC3 project. And all I did with it is I created a standard MVC3 project. I added a connection string to the database to my web config right here. And it points to the database that's called TechTuesday Demo that doesn't really exist yet. If we look in our database and do a refresh, there's no database there. So remember, in that slide, we didn't have to do anything with the database schema. It's going to get created from entities using Microsoft Code First. So I created I added the connection string. I added initialization for Microsoft Code First right here. And I also added the initialization for Supermodel to global.asa file. And that's the code that runs when the web application first starts. And the last thing that I did, or the last two things that I did, for those who are familiar with Code First, this is going to be pretty familiar. When you're working with Code First, you need to define something that's called DB context or database context. When you're working with Supermodel, you need to define something that's called unit of work. And those two things are actually pretty much the same thing, except that unit of work extends DB context. So I've created a unit of work class that derives from, so I've created my unit of work class that derives from unit of work. And right now we have a database that just has one table that I defined, DB set of users. And I created a user class that is also pretty simple. All it has is it's got a first name for the user, it's got a last name for the user, and I have a Boolean that tells me whether the user is currently active or not. And to make it a little bit more interesting, I made that active thing read-only. So you can read it, you can see if the user is active, but because it is protected here, you cannot set it from outside of the class. So in the constructor for the class, I set the active to be true, so the user is active to begin with. And then I have a separate method that allows me to disable a user by setting active to false. So what this really means is that I have a user that gets created, the user is active, and if I want to from outside of this class, I can disable this user, but once I disable the user, there's no way for me to make the user enabled again. So this is a way of deleting a user without deleting the user. Marking a user is deleted permanently. Then also notice that a user is derived from a class that's called entity, and it's a generic class, so it's an entity of the type user. And this is a requirement. In the Supermodel world, all of the entities need to derive from entity base class. And it's an abstract class that makes one requirement on your class. You need to implement a label, a string label property. And you need to get a getter for it. And basically what it is you need to provide a string representation of your object. So in our case, because we're talking about the user, when somebody is asking for a label, I'm going to return first name plus space last name. So a label for my user is going to be the name for that user. So that completes the explanation of what's been done so far. So let's go ahead and create a little website that allows us to manage the users. If you remember the slides I was showing you, on one of the slides it said that the only two things that you need to worry about are entities and form models. Everything else is provided to you by the framework. So we already have an entity, so let's go ahead and create a form model for the user. And all the form models for entities are derived from a base class that's called form model for entity base. And we need to give it the type of the entity that it's serving. So in our case, it's going to be a user. And here is the class that's going to define what goes on our screen. So I'm just going to copy and paste here. And I'm going to change the active not to be protected. So now I have on my screen a field that defines first name, a field that defines last name, and an active field. And to make it a little bit more interesting, now we can, because this is not our entity, we can use very freely and still stay sort of kosher. We can use some attributes that are specific to the presentation. So let's make first name a required field. And let's make last name a required field. And remember, our active field is a Boolean that tells us whether the user is active or not, but we really should not be able to set that directly. So I'm going to put in an attribute that tells me that on the screen it's going to only display the field, but it's not going to let me edit it. So that's all I needed to do for the form model. So we have the entity defined, we have a form model defined. Everything else we get for free, or as I said, almost for free. So we need because we're working in the MVC, we need a controller and we need a view. So let's go ahead and get our controller for free and get a view for free. So I'm going to controllers and I'm going to create a new controller. For those of you who are familiar with MVC, this should be right at home. For everybody else, I apologize if I'm going too fast. So I'm going to create users controller, and I don't really need to write anything in it. I'm just going to get rid of all of this extra code. And in order to implement a basic CRUD controller, all I need to do is I need to define from a base class here. So I'm going to, derive from a base class here. So I'm going to derive from a CRUD controller base. And the CRUD controller base is a generic base class that takes 3 type arguments. The first one is the type of our entity. The second one is the type of our form model. And the last one is the connection to the database, or my unit of work. And that's the entire class. As long as we CRUD controller base. As long as we derive from this class, this will give us the entire CRUD functionality in the controller. So now that we have the controller, we need to create the view for the user. And I'm going to go ahead and quickly do that. So I'm going to create a directory that's called users, actually. And I'm going to create 2 views under it. One is going to be a list view that's going to list all of the users for me. And another one is going to be an edit view that allows me to edit a user or create a new user. And to save you watching me from typing, I'm just going to copy 2 short snippets of code for these 2 views. So this is my list view, and I'll walk you through what I'm doing. So all I'm doing here is I define my model to be a list of users, and I specify the title on my page, and this is just using some namespaces. And then all I'm doing is I'm calling an HTML helper that's called CRUD list that's provided by Supermodel that's going to give me the list of my users. And I'm passing it my model, which is the list of my users, and I pass in the name of the controller for it, which we just created, which is called users controller, and the title for the page. And then I'm going to do a very similar copy and paste for the user screen. For the edit screen. And again, we have our model of a user form model type, and I'm just calling the HTML helper that's called CRUD edit. I'm passing it the type of the entity and the type of the form model and giving it a screen title, and we're done. We're done with a simple application that does CRUD for our user object. Notice that we haven't touched the database. We haven't wrote a single line of code that will define how it's going to look on the screen. You know what goes on the screen if we we have 3 fields in our form model, but our views do not mention any of those fields. So all of that is taken care of by the framework. We didn't have to worry about mapping our form model to the entity model because the framework will make an educated guess on how to map things based on the fact that form model and entity have fields or properties with the same name. And as long as they're the same name, and compatible types, the framework will take care of it for us. So if I didn't screw up anywhere, I'm going to run the application, and hopefully we'll see some results here. And then we'll make it a little bit more interesting. And the first time I run it, it takes a little bit longer because it needs to provision the database that we don't have right now. So here's our list of users, and let's go ahead and enter a couple of users. And so here we got an ability to enter users. We can go back and edit a user. We can delete a user. All of that we got for free. So let's, we've done this, and it's pretty simple. Let's make it just a little bit more interesting by adding, let's say we wanted to track the gender for the user. And in order to track the gender for the user, we want to introduce an enum that will define two possibilities. It's male or female. So I'm going to go back to my user class, and within my class, I'm going to define a simple enum. Public enum, gender enum. What did I do? Gender enum. And the possibilities are male and female. And now I can define a new property within our class. For those of you who work with Code First, you probably know that Code First does not support enums. So Supermodel provides you a replacement for enums that actually makes it really easy to work with enums without them being enums. So the class is called EFCF Entity Framework Code First Enum, and I'm going to call it gender. And I'm going to create a property here of the type gender. And in a constructor, I'm going to set the default gender to be, let's say, female. So notice how easy it is. I can just go ahead and assign gender the enum, and basically all of the assignments are overloaded. So you can pretty much treat this EFCF as a native enum. So now I took care of my entity. Now let's go ahead and add this to the screen. And let's say we wanted to display this gender as a drop-down. So on the screen, we want it to be a drop-down. And we define it as a drop-down, which is enum drop-down form model of the type. And we need to pass it the type of the enum that we're working with, which is, in our case, user gender enum. And I'm going to call it gender get and set. And if I run it now, it will whack my database with Barack Obama and Rick Perry because I have a new field in a database. And right now I'm running in a development mode. So anytime I change any of my entities, it'll create a new database. But notice how easy it was for me to just add a field. I only needed to add it in one place to add it to the entity, and another place to define how it looks on the screen. And now I can go ahead and enter other people. And hold on, something didn't work. Let me see. Oh, because I made it private. It needs to be public, sorry. So now I can go ahead and enter other people, and I can choose the gender and can click Save, and it's all in there. And it's important to note that form model really represents the UI, the presentation layer, and entity really represents the logic. So I can go back and without changing the business logic, let's say if I wanted this to be not a drop-down, but I wanted this to be a radio button, all I need to do is I need to change my form model to be a radio select and run it, and our framework will take care of things for us and generate render the code as a drop down. I'm sorry, as a radio button instead of the drop down. So just along the same lines, let's say our customer came back and said that we need to add a birth certificate to the user profile, and it's a binary file, so maybe we'll be storing it in a PDF. I will make it get and set. And I want to display it also on the screen, so and allow the user to enter it. So I'm going to say binary file form model birth certificate. And let's make it required. And I'm going to run it again. And I can go ahead and add a new user. And pick a file. I'll just grab a PDF and click Save. And now we have a user with a birth certificate that we can view. And notice how easy it was for me to modify my, if a customer comes back with new requirements, it was very easy for me to change the properties, to change the fields, to change the UI without having to hunt down many different places in my code. Go ahead.
But it dropped your database.
It dropped my database. That is absolutely true. As I mentioned earlier, I'm running in a code-first development mode, which in a development mode, what it does is that when you change your entity, it'll drop your database and recreate it for you. But there's ways around it, which is sort of outside the scope of this presentation. This would be a separate presentation on Microsoft Entity Framework Code First. So let me go back. So the important thing here is that Supermodel comes with a number of these, you can think of them almost as UI components because they know how to map themselves to the entity. They know how to render themselves in HTML. They know how to bind themselves when the data comes back from HTML. Supermodel comes with a whole bunch of different classes that pretty much cover all of your standard cases like drop-down, radio select, and binary file. And it takes care of that. But it's also very extendable. It allows you to write your own. And the way to write your own is to define a class that implements certain interfaces. And as long as it implements certain interfaces and then you define a property in a form model of that type, the framework will check if the interface is implemented. Instead of using the standard implementation, it will call the method on that interface to take care of things for you. So it's really easy to write your own, and it's really easy to extend this one. So for example, if for the binary file form model, let's say instead of clicking on it and being able to download, maybe we would upload an image, it would be really easy to inherit from this class and write your own HTML renderer that would actually show on the screen the birth certificate without really having to change anything else there. So all of the mapping, everything else stays the same. So power object-oriented design is that you just override what you need to override. So one more thing I wanted to do is our database is really simple right now. It's a relational database, but it only has one table. So let's go ahead and add an ability to define a user role and make that user role sort of definable by the people who use our system. So I'm going to create a new class, which is going to turn into a new table in our database. and I'm going to call it user role. And my user role will also need to derive from an entity of the type user role. And all I'm going to have here is I'm going to have public string name. And I'm going to have a description also. And because this is an entity, I need to implement my label, which is what I'm doing right now. I'm just going to return a name. So now that I have the user role class, what I can do is I can go back to my user and I can specify a property that's called user role. So I'm going to say public, and it needs to be virtual if we want just-in-time activation. This is a function of my Microsoft implementation of code first. So I'm going to say public virtual user role, and I'll just call it a role. And I'm going to do get and set. And now I want to display it for the user, and not only display it, but allow it as an input. So I'm going to say public, and let's say I want to display it as a drop-down. So I'm going to use drop-down form model, and I'm going to do get and set. And of course, I forgot the name of the property. So role, get, and set. And I just like my code just so. So I'm going to tidy it up a little bit. So now if I were to run this, it will reprovision my database with the roles table, and it will create a foreign key for me. But I didn't have to worry about any of that. That's all done by the framework. And if I look in my database, we will see that now we have a TechTuesday demo database that has users and user roles table. And for user roles, I could have very easily created CRUD, but not to show you something that you already saw. I'm just going to go ahead and provide a couple of user roles right here directly in the database so that our screen has something to look up. So I'll say president. And maybe vice president. And maybe secretary of state. So now if I go ahead and try to add a new user, now I have all of a sudden a drop-down with the possibilities of what I can enter. So let's say if I wanted to enter Hillary, I am all prepared to do that, and I can make her Secretary of State. I click Save, and here we have Hillary that we can edit and delete and do whatever we want with. So now what I've shown you so far is sort of, remember, Supermodel is about making simple things simple and complex things possible. So what I've shown you is how to make simple things simple. So we've taken some relational database, we created it, and we created very easy CRUD user interface for that relational database. And we used some stock components, and we were able to really get it up and running in no time. But let's see how we can make complex things possible. Let's say we want to tweak it a little bit to make it a little bit different, to make it a little bit non-stock, but hopefully without spending too much effort there. And what I want to do is I want to remind you that our user had this disable functionality. We had an active field, and we can actually go ahead and disable the user without deleting it from the database. So maybe that's what we want. Maybe our customer wants to make sure that all of the users stay in the database for posterity, but if we want to get rid of the user, we just deactivate the user. So first we need to make sure that you're no longer able to delete a user. So let's go ahead and do that. And what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go to my controller, and make sure that no user interaction can allow me to delete a user. So I have my, and I'm not going to the controller. This is the controller. So I have my controller that I haven't really done much with because it derives from my standard CRUD controller. But now I want to make sure that nobody can ever delete a user. So I'm going to go ahead and override the method that does the delete. And instead of doing whatever it normally does, I'm just going to throw an exception. So now if we were to run it and try to delete Hillary, we're going to get an exception. It's not going to be a very graceful way of handling it, but at least we can no longer delete a user when we don't want the user to be deleted. So let's make it graceful. What we want is we really don't want this delete button to be there in the first place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my list view, and for standard CRUD, we use the HTML helper that came with Supermodel. But here, we're just going to use standard Razor, which is standard engine for MVC view. And I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste a little bit of a code, and I'll walk through what I did there so that it's not painful to watch me type long sequences of code. But for anybody who is familiar with MVC, this is going to be pretty straightforward. So basically, we're rendering absolutely custom HTML, and we're saying users as a title, and we have a table with 2 columns, and the headers for the columns are name and actions. And then for each item in the model, which happens to be a list of users, I'm going, and for the first column, I'm displaying the label, which is going to happen to be the first name and last name of the user. And for the second column, I am generating an action link that will take me to the edit screen. And then after the table, after we're done iterating through all of them, I'm going to have another action link that will take me to create a new user. Basically, both of these things take me to the same view, but this one actually passes me a real ID, whereas this one passes me a 0 for the ID, which is an indication that I'm trying to create a new one. So if I run my project now we have everything as it was before, but the delete button is gone. And as you can, and the importance here is not that the delete button is gone, but we actually wrote our own HTML that was very simple, that generated the view while still leveraging the rest of the pieces that the framework gives us. And so now we have an ability to write as complex HTML as we want, or we can style it the way we want without really any limitations if we don't want the stuck implementation. So now that we got rid of the ability to delete the users, we really need to create an ability to disable users. And in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to add a disable button to our edit screen. Again, by going away from using standard implementation, I'm just going to go ahead and again grab a snippet of code, and I'll explain what's in that code in a second. Again, for anybody who has done MVC, this is going to be very straightforward. But basically, what I'm doing here is I have a title on the screen, then I have a using HTML helper begin form, which is a standard way of specifying a form in MVC. And I am checking if the ID of my user is 0. That means that I'm trying to create a new user. Instead of using an HTTP post, I'm going to be using HTTP put because my controller is truly RESTful. So I'm specifying the HTTP verb. And then this is important because I am not really rendering all of the fields on the user. If I were to add or remove fields on the user, they're still going to be rendered by calling this editor for model because I have a template for the user that is provided to me by default by the framework. So I'm calling this method that's going to generate all of the fields on the fly using reflection, all of the fields for the user form model, which is right here. That's my model. And then I have my submit button, and then I have my action link back to go to the list of users. And then if my model ID is not equals to 0, meaning that it does not equal to 0, meaning that I'm working with a user that's not a new user, I'm going to create a new action link that's going to allow me to disable a user. So I'm going to go ahead and run this code, and it's not going to work. So I'm going to go and click Edit. I have my disable button, I click disable, are you sure? Doesn't work. The reason it doesn't work is we don't have anything on the back end to handle it. We created a button, but it doesn't really send us anywhere. Turns out it's really easy to take care of that. All we need to do is we just create, in our controller, we just create a custom new method that, that's called disable. And in fact, instead of typing it, I'll just copy and paste and explain again. So here I create a new method for disabling a user. It's a standard action method in MVC. It's called disable. It takes the ID of the user. And this is kind of interesting. I didn't really talk about it, but basically in Supermodel, you wrap all of your transactions in a using statement for a new unit of work object. And basically everything that happens within these within this using statement is an atomic transaction. All of it happens or all of it doesn't happen. And by default, it actually commits. Only if you specify explicitly that you want to roll back, it will not commit. So that's a little bit different from some of the other frameworks. But basically, any changes, any objects that you're going to load here and modify are going to get saved unless you specify that you don't want to save it somewhere. So what I'm doing here is I am grabbing an entity item, which in my case is going to be a user. And what I'm doing is I'm calling a repo factory, which is my factory for repositories. And I'm asking it to create a repository for the type user. And remember, we didn't have to write a custom repository. This is going to be a default implementation of a repository that the framework is going to give to us. And then once I have this repository, I'm going to ask for the user by the ID of the ID that was passed to us. So that gives me the user, that loads the user for me from the database or from whatever persistent storage my repository happens to handle. The default one is going to go to the database. And then I'm just going to go ahead and call the disable method. And this is the disable method that I showed you earlier that exists in my class right here. That'll set my active Boolean to false. And then I'm just going to go back and redirect to my edit screen with this ID. So it basically it'll force it to refresh. And if I were to run it now, if I click Edit, we have the disable link here, which notice that right now the user is active. It's grayed out. I can't really change anything, but it's shown as active. If I click Disable and I click OK, it's gone exactly how we want it. Another way of implementing the same or similar functionality in a much simpler way would be for us if we went to our controller and we would have continued to use our standard HTML helper on the view and on the edit. What we could have done is we could have just taken this code and overrode the standard delete functionality. So when somebody presses the delete, it would actually take them to execute our code here. We would just, instead of this throwing an exception, we would do this. And then anytime anybody presses a delete button, it would basically hook it up to the disable functionality. So this hopefully gives you a little bit of a flavor of what you can do with Supermodel. Unfortunately, I couldn't really show you everything that could be done with it. But going back to the presentation, so what's in it for Noblesse in terms of the Supermodel? It's really a proven framework. It's vetted on the real project. In fact, we ship beta for SETS, which stands for Sustainability Evaluation Tracking System. And SETS is built on top of it. We ship beta. This is a project for Department of Defense. And as you can see, you can create much more sophisticated user interfaces with Supermodel than what I was able to do in a half-hour demo. And the framework really has proven to significantly improve the developer productivity. It encourages good domain-driven design and good object-oriented design. It encourages consistency, which is really important for good quality software. Produces really well-designed applications and really makes Agile easier because you saw how easy it is for me to modify my entity objects without having to hunt down multiple places in the code. And if customer changes their mind or wants to add something, it's really easy to react to this. And it can and will be used in other projects. Obviously, this is not set specific, and it's a general purpose framework. So as far as the call to action, you can get it on NuGet and start using it if you're on the Microsoft development stack. You can. It's also available in the Unique TFS, so go ahead and grab it. I'd be very happy to help anybody who wants to use Supermodel for their projects. And that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about today. And I'll take questions if you guys have any.